To date, the United States has allowed in about 2,200 Syrian refugees. The U.S. president wants to add 10,000 more, but as you heard, he faces fierce opposition. I talked about this with writer and editor Elizabeth MacBride.
Well, the answer is that we have a quota system here in the U.S. We have the largest refugee resettlement program in the world. But every year the president gives numbers to Congress and says this is how many we should admit from each country, and the number from Syria has been low since 2011.
What's the process like for the refugees to make that transition from there to the United States?
Well, when I interviewed people working with resettled refugees, they told me it's the toughest process in the world. It involves 20 different steps, and it begins with the UN. You have to first be certified a refugee before you're even considered by the United States. So that's the beginning, and a woman from the Church World Service who works extensively with Syrian refugees told me that many times the UN will screen people out and say, you won't pass the US filters, so don't even bother to apply. After you pass the UN's filters, and then you go through a rigorous 14-point step in the US, which involves the Department of Homeland Security, fingerprinting, interviews in person. It's a long process.
You've been to Jordan, to these refugee camps. What's your takeaway? I mean, what have you seen? What has touched you?
Well, there were so many things that touched me there. I went twice. Actually, I was there on Christmas Eve last year, visiting with a young woman in the camp. She was about 20. She had been married at the age of 14 in her village back in Syria, landed in the refugee camp, had to flee because of the war, arrived there pregnant, had a miscarriage after she arrived at the camp, and then sort of pulled herself together, and with the help of some of the nonprofits, began running a reading program for about 100 kids in the camp.
You talked earlier about the steps, jumping through all these hoops. So talk to me about the backlog. How long a wait is it? Let's say I'm someone in that refugee camp in Jordan that you saw. How long do I have to wait before the green light?
Well, I mean, it's really an unattainable. Coming to the United States for Syrian refugees in those camps is an unattainable goal. I mean, I think they apply, a tiny handful apply if they have family in the United States. So I think that's something else that the debate is missing, is this idea that many of the refugees being resettled here have family connections here already. Because otherwise they're going to go to Europe, right? Why even try to go to the United States? Europe is much easier. So it's a years-long process, 2 years, probably more than 2 years in most cases.
Let's say I'm that refugee, I go through that process for 2 years. Then I come to the United States. I've gone through the shock of going through a war, living in a refugee camp. Now there's the shock of being assimilated into a new society. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, I think there are two things to say. First of all, you know, Iraqi refugees, who would probably be similar to Syrians in many respects, have apparently assimilated very well. And if you do research and look, there are a lot of stories of Iraqi success stories, people starting small businesses. Actually, Syrians even who have come earlier run a number of the small grocery stores in the Detroit area. So there's a great history here of refugees from the Middle East coming and succeeding in the United States. Right now, as you know from the reporting you've done and the reporting, the work your colleagues have done, there is a big backlash going on, which throws a lot of those success stories into question.